John chapter 18. It's on page 656 if you're using one of the Pew Bibles. Today we'll examine the third message as we've been working through these chapters in the book of John. And we will examine Jesus in his trial before Pilate, Pilate being the Roman governor of the region of Judea, also known as Pontius Pilate by some. So John 18, I'm going to begin reading in verse 28, and we'll read through verse 16 of chapter 19. Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out unto them, and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up to thee. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again, and called Jesus, and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, saying, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from hence. Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate saith unto him, What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews, and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. But ye have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will ye therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? They cried all again, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus, and scourged him. And the soldiers platted a crown of thorns, and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they smote him with their hands. Pilate therefore went forth again, and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man. When the chief priests therefore saw, and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate saith unto them, Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid. And went again into the judgment hall, and saith unto Jesus, Whence art thou? Or where did you come from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have the power to crucify thee, and have power to release thee? Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. From thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not a friend of Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth, and sat down in the judgment seat, in the place that is called the pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover. And about the 6th hour, and he saith unto the Jews, Behold your king. And they cried away. Then they cried out, Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him! Pilate saith unto them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answered, We have no king but Caesar. Then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. Pilate and the religious leaders, the Jews, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees, the lawyers, the chief priests, etc., all those names intermingled that led Israel, Pilate and them did not get along at all. And flowing through an undercurrent of this whole passage is their disdain and contention for one another. And what we see in this passage are 7 shifts. Pilate in, Pilate out. Pilate in, Pilate out. Going in and out of the judgment hall. And this presents itself as a chiasm or a chiasm, and it works centered all around verses 1 through 3 of chapter 19 and the scourging of Jesus. And it goes into that and then comes out of that. And so that's what we'll follow by way of a outline. First we see this, Pilate and the request for judgment. Pilate and the request for judgment. The questioning of Jesus by Caiaphas is not recorded in John. So last week we looked at the questioning by Annas, but after he was with Annas, he's then led away to Caiaphas. John doesn't record that for whatever reason, but if we go to Mark 14, we have that listed for us. The highlight at the end of that questioning by Caiaphas was that Caiaphas charged Jesus with blasphemy. The chief priests and the Pharisees all agreed, and thus Mark 14:64 tells us they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Following this is where we pick up the story. They lead Jesus to the Roman Praetorion, or Praetorian, and that is the Hall of Judgment. It's a specific place where the Roman governor, in this case, or a judge of the Romans, would sit down and issue a sentence. Verse 28, however, includes an incredibly vital note for us at the last part of it. They themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. The implications of this note are incredibly and particularly incriminating for these Jews. They didn't enter because if they entered, they'd become defiled. They would be unclean, therefore unable to take part in the Passover meal, which is about 12 hours away. So these events have been taking place all night, and now it is roughly sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. when we come to chapter 19, and he says it's the 6th hour. I believe it's in verse number 13. 14 it is. It's the 6th hour. The 6th hour, we believe, John is referencing, is 6 a.m. in speaking how the Romans kept time. And so this is happening between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. It's the day of preparation. The day when they should have been going and slaughtering the lamb, dressing the lamb, preparing it for the feast that they were going to observe in just 12 hours at 6 p.m., when the Jewish day started, yet instead of instead of killing and preparing that lamb, they were more concerned about taking the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world and crucifying him in its place. There's a lot of irony within this rule that they made and this fact. Because the rule they're referencing about going in and being defiled is not a biblical rule, rather it's an added rule that they added to the Scriptures. But don't worry, they were fine adding to the Scriptures and observing that rule, never mind the fact that they were putting an innocent man to death. Apparently putting an innocent man to death didn't make you unclean, just going into a Gentile dwelling did. They twisted God's laws. They made it easier to remain outside the judgment hall and convince themselves, we're clean, we're innocent, we've done nothing wrong. And by doing so, what's that? But crucify him. Yeah. We'll get Pilate to do our dirty work for us. The thought is this, they didn't cast the proverbial first stone, so we're clean. We're fine. That's the problem with religion. You can be unequivocally guilty and yet somehow still maintain innocence and guiltlessness. because religion often allows you to twist and contort clear and plain commands into something they are not, and that's why so often religious people are considered hypocrites, because they present themselves as clear and or as clean, and everybody knows they're dirty, but they've twisted and contorted things to make themselves look good. Religion devoid of relationship leads to outward showings of piousness, all while inwardly you're just like Jesus said of these Pharisees, full of dead men's bones. Maybe they said it this way: I know I led Jesus to Pilate. I know I was there shouting, "Crucify him," but I didn't nail him to the cross, so I'm innocent. Same kind of defense is used today. Well, why? I was just driving the car. So-and-so pulled the trigger and killed the person. I didn't do it. I didn't kill him. Clearly involved, but didn't take part in the specific act, so I'm innocent. Outwardly showing and claiming holiness, yet inwardly lives wrecked by sin. Verse 29, Pilate comes out. And he asks him, what accusation do you have against Jesus? And apparently thinking Jesus would simply take their word for it, they respond that if he were not a malefactor, in other words, if he were not an evildoer, a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you. So in other words, they just wanted Pilate to take their word. Oh, he's a criminal? Okay, cool. Yeah, crucify him, whatever. Pilate, apparently, not in the mood to play games, said, well, okay, then you take him and judge him. You take care of him. Now again, we see them act as though they were holy, and when they respond to this, oh, well, you know Roman law says we can't put anyone to death. We wouldn't put anyone to death. All acting pious again, knowing very well they had no problem stoning someone that they caught in sin. They caught someone in adultery, what'd they do? They'd haul them out and stone them to death right there. They had no problem executing someone. The kicker was this: they did not want Jesus' blood on their hands, because they knew he's innocent. We know he's innocent, so we can't put him on us. So we'll get Rome to kill him. Then we'll look clean. We'll be clean. We'll convince ourselves we're clean. And really the whole thing is just a sham to attempt to appease their evil conscience. So this is what they tell Pilate in Luke 23:2. We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, which is an outright lie, because if you remember what Jesus said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and render unto God that which is God. He couldn't have been much more clear, so he wasn't saying that. And then they add on to it and say here, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So now we have it. We brought him to Pilate. They've accused him of sedition. And now we've said he's trying to start a rebellion against Rome. That's the problem here. And they've effectively told the governor, we want you to crucify him. I find it amazing how absolutely blind they were. These are the people that know the Scriptures. Most of them can quote the Scriptures right from their head. They know, they can bounce back to a book and say, oh, it's so-and-so said, Zechariah 9 said, da-da-da-da-da-da. And yet they don't see how clearly they're playing right into what God said in the Scriptures was going to happen. They don't see clearly what Jesus had spoken to them and told them was going to happen. Yeah. They clearly missed connecting the dots. Jesus predicted in John chapter 12, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. This he said, signifying by what death he would die. If the Jews were to kill him, their capital punishment was stoning. The Romans crucified. They didn't even realize they were playing straight into exactly what Jesus told them. He was going to die by crucifixion. So the request for judgment has been put forth to Pilate. Thus we see, secondly, Pilate and the questioning of Jesus. Pilate and the questioning of Jesus. Now armed with an accusation of sedition that he can't avoid, Pilate enters the chamber, begins to question Jesus, and his first question was a very clear question, but it was a very odd question. Are you the king of the Jews? The reason it was odd is because Jesus looked nothing like a king. John doesn't tell us, But following his appearance between Annas and Caiaphas, we're told in Luke 22 that the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?" And many other things they blasphemously spoke unto him. No, he didn't look like a king at all. In fact, John Phillips said it this way: the question contained an element of astonishment. Nothing about Jesus suggested royalty. He was obviously poor. He had been up all night and had endured not only the agony in the garden, but he had been bullied by the Sanhedrin, beaten by the temple police. Nor did Jesus exhibit any of the fierce traits or fanatical patriotism the Romans were accustomed to meet in other Jewish liberators and insurrectionists. If this man was a king, the king of the Jews, he was certainly a different kind of king than Pilate would have expected. So, Jesus' response kind of puts Pilate on edge. Are you calling me a king? Or did somebody tell you I'm a king? Or I'm claiming to be a king? And surely that's a logical question to ask, because with all that's transpired, Pilate has got to be suspicious. He's got to be very suspicious of this whole thing. First of all, it's sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. in the morning. Generally, you don't do a lot of business during that time frame, most often. And not only that, it was completely unheard of for a Jew, or multiple Jews, to bring another Jew to the Romans. You don't turn over another Jew to the Romans because they took pride in who they were, and they hated the Romans. Thus, Pilate's response: am I a Jew? I'm not calling you. No, not me. Well, why would I call you a king? I'm a Roman. I'm Pilate the governor. Caesar is my king. I wouldn't dare call you a king. I'd risk my spot here if I called you a king. In fact, they're the ones who turned you in. They brought you to me. What on earth did you, a Jew, do to them, so much so that other Jews are willing to turn you over to me? And Jesus kind of responds like this: it's because I'm a king. I have a kingdom. Don't worry, though. Don't worry, Pilate. My kingdom's not of this earth. If my desire, if my goal was to build up a kingdom here on earth, when they came for me in the garden, when Peter pulled out his sword and chopped off Malchus's ear, we all would have pulled out swords and we all would have started fighting. But my kingdom's not here on earth, therefore we didn't fight. Thus, why the Jews had no use for Jesus. They wanted a military Messiah, not a spiritual Messiah. Pilate, though, jumps on that question, or that statement. Oh, so you admit you're a king. You are a king then. If Pilate wanted to retain his position in his life, he couldn't afford an uprising. And Jesus' response helps Pilate understand, yes, I'm a king, but I was born, I came into the world with another purpose, to do something much better, much grander than simply being a king. I came to bear witness to the truth. And then he adds, and those that hear the truth, those that listen to the truth, those that hear my voice, they're my subjects, those that do the truth. And verse 38 records this: Pilate said unto him, what is truth? The eternal question that's been asked by so many. Oh, what is truth? Many today, of course, would have us believe that truth is subjective. It's based on our feelings. It's based on our personal opinions. And thus some people say, oh, I have my truth and you have your truth. And generally how it is neither of them are really the truth, but one way or another. Truth, however, is not subjective. Truth is objective. It is based on fact. It is based on evidence. Thus, there's no way around the truth. If something is true, you can say all you want to that it's not, it still remains true. Thus, those that are opposed to the truth are forced now to either accept the truth or reject the truth. And that's why many people have done. They've put barriers up. They've made it so we don't have to look at the truth. Others simply repeat lies over and over and over again, and they do it so much that they sear their conscience. So much so that they can't even recognize the truth when the truth is presented before them because they've fooled themselves. So what is truth? Pilate asked it as a question, but not really seeking an answer. His goal was simply that if we just get this whole hullabaloo that's going on, let it come to an end. That way I can go back inside and go to sleep. And thus the third shift. Pilate in the pronouncement of innocence. Pilate is determined that Jesus is not a threat to the Roman Empire. So rather simply he tells them, I find no fault in him. Sure, he's claiming to be a king, but of some spiritual kingdom. He's not a king to the herd of Rome. I have no reason to sentence him. By telling them this, by telling them I found no fault in him, Pilate was trying to tell them, the Romans are not coming to destroy you. The Romans are not going to come and wipe out the religious leaders because of Jesus. We're not going to take away your religious power. That was, after all, what they said in John 11:48. I think we talked about it last week. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. That was their concern. And so Pilate kind of assures them, no, we're not going to come and do that because of Jesus. Now, at this point, it would have been wise of Pilate simply to conclude the trial, release Jesus, and go back inside. But unfortunately, Pilate kept speaking. And he made an offer to the Jews, an offer that he would come to regret, and an offer that would trap him. He offered them the customary release of a Jewish prisoner on the day prior to the Passover, the day of preparation of which it was. Likely his thinking is this: surely they would rather Jesus, an innocent man, a man who's already been beaten, a man who's obviously not a threat, surely they would rather he be freed, he be let go, than to actually let a true criminal go. Rather, someone that has been tried, someone that is guilty, someone that's already been sentenced to death. Surely they'd rather Jesus to a man, say, like Barabbas. Barabbas is said to be a robber in this text. I believe it's Luke that tells us he was a robber and a murderer. So surely they'd rather he release Jesus as opposed to Barabbas, right? Their hatred of Jesus was this. They so violently hated Jesus, they cried for the release of Barabbas. The irony is this: they traded Jesus, the Son of God, the true Son of the Father, for a man named Barabbas, which means the Son of the Father. And so now, Pilate's plan has appeared to backfire. Jesus remains on his hands, and he must decide now, what am I going to do with Jesus? And that's the all-important question. That's the question the Jewish leaders were asking there in John 11:48. What are we going to do with Jesus? If we let him go, he's going to destroy everything we've built up. What are we going to do with Jesus? That's what Pilate has been facing since the moment Jesus entered that courtyard. What will I do with Jesus? And that's the question we all face. The greatest question in the world is not how old is the earth. It's not our view on the Trinity. It's not creation versus evolution. It's not Calvinism, Arminianism. What better explains God and man's role in salvation? That's not the greatest question in the universe. It's not all the other questions that really revolve around the biblical text. Rather, the greatest question, whether we like it or not, is this: what am I personally going to do with Jesus? Am I going to believe him? Am I going to trust in him? Am I going to accept that he's done everything that I need to be back in a relationship with God himself? Like he said back in John 17, am I going to trust that he's going to give me eternal life? The perfect, everlasting relationship with God himself? Will I believe that? Or will I believe something else? Anything else? Will I reject him? Will I attempt to work my way into God's graces by another way? Or maybe do as so many have done and simply deny there's a God altogether. To Pilate's shame, his decision of what to do with Jesus begins in chapter 19, where we see Jesus, or Pilate, in the scourging of Jesus. Pilate in the scourging of Jesus. Pilate, therefore, took Jesus and scourged him. And surely by doing this, Jesus and his followers, if they had any inklings or any thoughts in their head that maybe we'll attack Rome, now that Jesus has been beaten, he's been scourged, he's been flogged in such a manner that he's within an inch of his life, surely they're not going to do anything. And surely the Jews will be satisfied that he is no longer a threat to them. And then again, they can go celebrate their Passover in peace, and I can go back to living my life and go to sleep. Scourging, flogging was vile in every imagination of it. Mark 15 records the soldiers, the handful of soldiers that were guarding Jesus, they went and got the entire garrison of soldiers and brought them out to participate in this event. And while we find that the Jews, when they flogged or scourged someone, they were, according to the law, they could only strike them 39 times, 40 stripes save one, and Paul had that happen to him multiple times. But the Romans did not have such a law, and they were merciless. In fact, they were so merciless that many times the person that was scourged or flogged didn't even live to be crucified because of the terrors of this scourging. The whip they would use. It's described as being made of several pieces of leather with bone, glass, and even lead embedded in it. The victim would be stripped naked, his hands tied to a post above him so that he cannot even defend himself or protect himself. A medical doctor described the scourging like this. The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across Jesus' shoulders, back, and legs. At first, the heavy thongs cut through the skin only. Then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels in the underlying muscles. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue. But that wasn't all. Upon finishing this beating, they took it to a particularly another level. They got a purple robe and they put a purple robe on him. Then they took a crown of thorns, or they took thorns and they twisted the thorns into a crown and put it on his head, thus producing even more bleeding as head wounds bleed more. And not to mention that, in Mark 15:19 it records that they went out and got a rod and began beating him and striking him on the head with the rod, effectively impaling those thorns into him. Then they began to spit on him and punch him. And by this time, as Isaiah 52 said, his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. And if that weren't enough, they added more insult to injury. They took the rod that they'd been beating him with, shoved it in his hand, and began to mock him by saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and bowing down before him as if they were worshiping him. And yet, he endured it all for you and for me. He didn't call those 12 legions of angels he could have to destroy the soldiers and stop them from their mockery and their terrors on him. No, he endured it for you and me. He didn't call on his Father and ask the Father to come to his defense and put a stop to this now. No, because he was enduring what we should have endured for us. The final three acts of this story mirror the previous three, or the previous first three. First, we have Pilate in the request for the innocent. The request for the innocent. Perhaps thinking that maybe when they hear me say again, I don't find any fault in him, he's guiltless, and perhaps now that they've seen this brutally terrorized body of Jesus, they will consider Jesus' punishment to be sufficient. But Pilate again found no mercy in their eyes. Standing before them, an innocent man, beaten, adorned in purple and a crown of thorns, and yet their hearts were hard and calloused. There was no compassion. And as Pilate says to them, "Behold the man, look at this man," what do they say? "Crucify." Bloodthirsty. Pilate again tries to put the burden back on the insatiable people by telling them, well, if that's how you feel, you take him and crucify him, because I don't find any fault in him. Knowing that they were not allowed to crucify someone, a spokesman answers back and tells him, well, he made himself the Son of God. And so now Pilate, who has been pushed much farther than he ever wanted to go, Pilate's efforts have all failed, and now he's got this mob on his hand. And the very instant these words touch his ear, a very urgent and a very whole new problem has emerged. Sure, Pilate believed in a plethora of gods, as did most of the Romans. Gods like Asclepius, or someone we might be familiar with like Hercules. What if this Jesus is Hercules' son? Well, what if this Jesus is one of those gods? Or maybe what if this Jesus truly is the son of this God that the Jews claimed was over all gods? What if Jesus was his son? And thus Pilate's fear has now seemingly reached a deafening roar. Pilate was not so much interested in their religious reasons for wanting to be rid of Jesus, as he was horrified at the possibility that what they said about Jesus might be true. Never before had a man looked at him with such clear and honest eyes. Never before had a man been so calm, reserved, silent, and unafraid. Never before had a man endured scourging and scoffing with such dignity. It was not just stoicism, it was absolute victory. And most amazing of all, what he read in this man's face, what shone out of his wonderful face, was love. Love that transcended hate. And so Pilate takes Jesus back inside for a second time. We see again the questioning of Jesus. And he asks Jesus, he starts out, well, where are you from? But he doesn't get an answer. And by this point now, unnerved and in an attempt to get an answer, he reminds Jesus, don't you know who I am? I'm Pilate. I can crucify you if you want me to. I can also let you go without doing anything to you. But the answer Pilate received probably chilled him to the bone. The hairs on his neck probably stood. Because before him was Jesus, dried blood all over him. Fresh blood probably still leaking from various injuries. Probably barely unable to stand. Probably barely able to speak. His eyes are probably almost swollen shut by now. And yet through his bloodied mouth and probably blood splattering out of his mouth as he spoke, Jesus says to Pilate, you could have no power against me at all unless it had been given you from above, from God Himself. If God hadn't allowed you to do this, you would have never have done it, Pilate. Oh, and Pilate knows now this is no ordinary man. Sure, he's from Nazareth, but he's not just from that town, Nazareth. He's from somewhere else. And we're told from that moment on, the moment he heard Jesus say those words, he wanted nothing to do with what was happening. All he wanted to do was let Jesus go. Deeply convicted, and lest he pile on more damnation on himself, he just wanted to let Jesus go. Well, Pilate was not innocent. And we know Pilate was far from an innocent man. Jesus assured him, the person that brought you to me is more guilty. His sin is much greater than anything you've done, Pilate. And probably one of the saddest parts of this entire story is that Pilate is gripped, his heart is gripped with conviction and the fear of God, and yet in almost a moment, he goes from the fear of God to the fear of man. So lastly, we encounter Pilate in the pronouncement of judgment. He made it clear to the Jews, I'm releasing Jesus. But the Jews kind of reach in their back pocket and pull out a trump card, if you will, and say, yeah, but he said he's a king. And anybody that says they're a king is against Caesar. And if you let him go, you're letting go a friend of Caesar. And if you align yourself with Jesus by letting him go, you're standing against Caesar. And so Pilate has to decide now, what am I going to do with Jesus? Am I going to allow this innocent man to go free and possibly face the backlash of Caesar? Or am I going to sentence an innocent man to death and carry on as though nothing has ever happened? He chooses to fear man rather than God. He brings Jesus to the place of judgment, and though he did not necessarily intend it to be a quote, we can look back and we can see the parallel and see how, again, these experts of Scriptures failed to see the signs before them, what they should have seen, that their Messiah, their long-awaited King, and they missed what was right in front of them. In verse 14, Pilate says this, behold thy king, or behold your king. Zechariah 9:9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, your king is coming to you. Riding on the colt. And they totally missed that just a week before, Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a colt, with the people crying, Hosanna, King, glory to God in the highest. But now, these religious leaders, these people that are supposed to represent Zion, those that are supposed to represent Jerusalem, are now shouting and crying, away with him! Away with him! Crucify him! And Pilate responds, shall I crucify your king? And we notice that it specifically says the chief priests, the ones, the top dogs over them all, respond emphatically, we have no king but Caesar. They rejected the very God they claimed to worship, and in the very same breath swore allegiance to Caesar Augustus. John Phillips said it this way, it was the formal abdication of the nation's messianic hope. And God has taken them at their word. For the greater part of the Christian era, the Jews have been aliens in Gentile lands. They have known no king but Caesar. They have been made to drink the dregs, the bitter cup they raised to heaven that day. They have now begun to return to their ancestral home. But there is to arise yet a Caesar to be their king, a Roman Antichrist who will wring even more dregs than could ever be imagined for them out of this cup, the cup of Revelation 13. Until at long last they look on him whom they pierced and own him king indeed. As I did last week, I submit that the rejection of his own people hurt Jesus far worse and much more painfully than all the suffering he endured at the hands of the soldiers. Here's Yahweh, the God of Israel, the covenant I am, the great I am, who has been with them and done so much for Israel over and over and over again. Now he's walking among them, healing them, raising their dead to life, doing miracles before their eyes for over 3.5 years, and they have the audacity to look Jesus in the face and cry, crucify. Phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. Matthew 27, verses 24 and 25, tell us that when Pilate saw he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. Putting it back on them. And verse 25 records, and all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and our children. The boiling rage that had consumed them when Pilate introduced Jesus as their king led them to take on themselves and even onto their children the very thing they sought to pawn off on the Romans in the first place, his blood. And so Pilate turns Jesus over to them, and Mark records it this way: when they had mocked him, they took the purple off of him, that robe that has now been soaked with blood and has been sticking to his body, and now they take it off of him, opening up wounds and causing more bloodshed. And they led him out to crucify him. We don't know the fates of Pilate, the soldiers, the Pharisees, all the chief priests and the lawyer. We don't know the fate of everybody that's involved in this affair of crucifying Jesus. But I do know this: they all faced Jesus again, because they all died. I know the terror to pass from this life thinking, we crucified Jesus, we saved ourselves, we saved all the Jews from this horrible man named Jesus, only to wake up on the other side and there is Jesus, hole in his side, holes in his hands, sitting at the right hand of God himself. What a scary position to have been in. And really, again, like I said earlier, it wasn't the first time I said it, won't be the last in my intention anyway, but the most important question is, what are you personally going to do with Jesus? I believe, regarding last week's message, that if Judas had turned, repented, and sought forgiveness, Jesus would have been standing there, arms open wide, to welcome Judas back in. I believe that was also possible for all these men that shouted, "Crucify him," that day. But I haven't been sent to preach to Judas, and I haven't been sent to preach Jesus to these men. I've been sent to preach Jesus Christ crucified and risen again to you. And so as we consider the terrors that Jesus underwent on our behalf, I ask one more time, what are you going to do with Jesus? Let's pray.